The chandeliers at the Sterling Grand Hotel glittered like frozen fireworks, casting light over a ballroom filled with New York's richest and most ruthless. The air smelled of champagne, ambition, and arrogance. A string quartet played softly near the marble staircase as waiters glided between tables carrying silver trays. Among them was Grace Evans, 26, wearing a crisp black uniform that fit a little too tightly at the seams. Her shoes, scuffed, patched twice, and softened by years of double shifts, were the only part of her she owned outright. She moved carefully, her hands steady despite the ache in her shoulders. Tonight was the 50th anniversary gala of Sterling Group, one of the most powerful conglomerates in the country. The founder's son and current CEO, Alexander Sterling, stood near the stage, tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in a custom tuxedo that probably cost more than Grace's yearly rent. He radiated money and the kind of confidence that comes from never hearing the word no. "Watch the glasses," whispered another waitress, passing by. Grace nodded, balancing a tray of crystal flutes filled with champagne. As she approached a cluster of executives laughing too loudly, one of them reached for a glass and brushed her arm. The tray tilted. She caught it, barely, but one drop of champagne landed on the marble floor, a golden bead that rolled straight toward Alexander's shoes. His sharp blue eyes snapped toward her. "Are you kidding me?" His voice sliced through the chatter like a blade. Grace froze. "I'm sorry, sir. It won't happen again." He looked her up and down, his gaze landing on the shoes, his mouth curled into a smirk. "You're working an event for billionaires, and you show up looking like that?" The room went quiet. The string quartet stumbled to a stop. Every whisper in the ballroom seemed to hang on that single, cruel sentence. Grace's throat tightened. "They all were clean, sir. Clean?" He let out a short, bitter laugh. "Those things belong in a dumpster. My company pays good money for presentation, and this," he gestured at her feet, "isn't it. You represent us tonight, whether you realize it or not." Her manager hurried over, pale-faced. "Mr. Sterling, please, she's one of our best." "Then you need better standards." Alexander turned back to Grace, his voice cold as glass. "You're fired, effective immediately." A collective gasp rippled through the guests. Cameras flashed. Someone muttered, "Over shoes." Another whispered, "That poor girl." Grace felt the sting behind her eyes, but she refused to let the tears fall. She set the tray down slowly on the nearest table and straightened her back. "Understood, sir." Alexander turned away, satisfied, already basking in the power of his own humiliation act. "Someone escort her out," he ordered. 2 security guards stepped forward. Grace walked between them, her shoes clicking softly against the marble. She didn't look at anyone. Shame burned under her skin, but deeper than that, something else was stirring. As she reached the door, a man at the far end of the ballroom, older, silver-haired, in a tailored grey suit, was watching her intently. His name was Martin Hale, the CEO of Sterling Group. Unlike Alexander, his expression wasn't one of disgust. It was recognition. His jaw tightened, as if a secret he'd buried long ago had just come alive. Grace turned once more before stepping into the corridor. Alexander raised his glass in mock salute, a cruel smile playing at his lips. But Martin didn't move. He just whispered under his breath, barely audible beneath the hum of shocked voices, "You have no idea who you just fired." And in that single moment, the balance of power in the Sterling Empire began to crack. The city was quieter after midnight. Neon signs blinked through the drizzle, and the sound of distant traffic echoed off wet pavement. Grace Evans sat on the edge of her small bed in a one-room apartment in Queens, still wearing the same uniform she'd been fired in. The black fabric smelled faintly of champagne and humiliation. Her phone buzzed. Another notification, another news clip. The headline on her cracked screen read, "Billionaire CEO fires waitress over shoes during gala." There it was, her face, frozen mid-apology, plastered across social media. Thousands of comments. some angry, some mocking, all of them strangers. She turned the phone over and let it fall onto the blanket. The silence that followed was louder than the city outside. From the corner of the room came a soft cough. "Gracie?" The voice was thin, trembling. Her grandmother, Eleanor. Grace quickly wiped her eyes and forced a small smile. "I'm right here, Grandma. Go back to sleep." The old woman shifted beneath her blanket on the couch. "You still working late?" "Not tonight." Grace's voice cracked on the last word. Eleanor blinked, confusion clouding her faded blue eyes. "You didn't lose that job too, did you?" Grace hesitated, then knelt beside her. "It's okay. I'll find another one." The truth was, there wasn't much left to find. She'd already been juggling 3 jobs, 2 at diners and 1 at the catering agency that had sent her to the Sterling Gala. That last one had paid just enough to cover her grandmother's medication. Without it, the math didn't work anymore. She stood and walked to the small kitchenette. The fridge hummed like it was the only thing still alive in the room. Inside, a few slices of bread, a jar of peanut butter, and a half-empty bottle of milk. Grace made 2 sandwiches, one for her grandmother, one for herself. She wasn't hungry, but the act of making food was comforting. Something that felt normal. On the counter sat a wooden box, scuffed and old. Her mother's box. It was the only thing she had left after the accident that took her parents when she was 10. She opened it sometimes when the world felt too heavy, when she needed to remember there had been love before the struggle. She ran her fingers over the contents. A faded photograph of her mother in a white blouse, smiling at the camera. A silver bracelet. A folded piece of paper yellowed with time. Tonight, her eyes caught something she'd never noticed before. A small envelope taped to the bottom of the lid, nearly hidden beneath the lining. Her pulse quickened. She peeled it loose. Written on the front, in neat handwriting, were 2 words. "For Grace." She tore it open carefully. Inside was a letter, and beneath it a document stamped with a corporate seal. The paper was crisp, the ink slightly faded. It read, "Sterling Group, Confidential Partnership Agreement." Her mother's name, Evelyn Evans, was printed beside another, Martin Hale. Grace frowned, reading the first few lines. The agreement spoke of a founding partnership, joint ownership, and equal distribution of shares upon succession. None of it made sense. Her mother had never talked about any partnership, let alone one with a company that owned half of Manhattan. She looked at the signature. Real ink, not a copy. Her mother's handwriting. Beneath it, the familiar swirl of a fountain pen that matched the name she'd just seen on the paper. Martin Hale. The same man who had looked at her in the ballroom as if he'd seen a ghost. Grace's breath caught in her throat. She folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and sat motionless for a long moment. Outside, thunder rolled across the city, deep and distant. She whispered to herself, barely audible over the rain against the window. "Mom, what did you do?" And for the first time since the gala, Grace felt something stronger than shame. She felt the pull of a mystery that could change everything. By morning, the city had traded rain for a thin, grey sunlight that made everything look tired. Grace stood on the corner of Madison and 54th, staring up at the shimmering glass tower that housed Sterling Group headquarters. The building was more than just an office. It was a monument to money. The kind of place that made ordinary people walk a little faster, as if they didn't belong on the same block. She clutched the envelope she'd found in her mother's box. Every instinct told her to go home. Forget it. Find another job. But another voice, quieter, steadier, told her to walk inside. The letter had her mother's signature, and the same company name that had just humiliated her in front of the entire city. "Morning, miss," the doorman greeted with polite indifference. His eyes flicked to her worn coat and hesitated just long enough to make her feel small. Grace lifted her chin. "I'm here to see Martin Hale." The man blinked. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," she said, her voice steady. "But he'll want to see me." He started to respond, but before he could, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The driver opened the rear door, and out stepped Alexander Sterling himself. Immaculate suit, perfect hair. sunglasses despite the weak light. The air around him seemed to bend, like the world tilted to accommodate his ego. He didn't notice Grace at first, but when he did, his expression hardened. You. Grace's stomach twisted. She could feel every pair of eyes in the lobby turn toward them. Alexander's tone was sharp, clipped. I thought I made it clear you're not welcome anywhere near my company. I'm not here for you, she said quietly. I need to talk to your CEO. His laugh was short and cold. Martin Hale doesn't meet with waitresses who can't afford new shoes. Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't look away. Then maybe he'll make an exception. Alexander stepped closer, his voice dropping. You should be grateful I didn't blacklist you completely. You embarrassed me in front of my investors. Walk away before I have security do it for you. The words hit hard, but before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension. That won't be necessary. Martin Hale had appeared behind the glass security gates, his silver hair perfectly in place, his calm presence like a sudden shift in temperature. He gave Alexander a cool look before turning to Grace. Miss Evans, isn't it? Grace nodded, caught between shock and relief. Come with me, Martin said simply. We'll talk upstairs. Alexander stared at him, disbelief flashing across his face. You can't be serious. You're giving her your time after what she pulled. Martin's eyes never left Grace. I'm giving her what she deserves. The elevator ride to the top floor was silent, except for the hum of machinery. Grace's pulse was loud in her ears. The walls were lined with mirrors, and in the reflection she saw Martin studying her, not with suspicion, but with curiosity. When the doors opened, she was greeted by an office that looked more like a museum. Mahogany walls, oil paintings, a skyline view worth a fortune. She'd never seen anything like it. Martin gestured toward a seat. I suppose you want to know why I didn't stop what happened last night. Grace hesitated. I'm not sure what I want to know yet, but I think my mother worked for this company. Her name was Evelyn Evans. Martin's expression shifted, just slightly, but enough to confirm something. I know who she was, he said quietly. She was more than an employee. She was the soul of this company once. Grace clutched the envelope tighter. Then you'll tell me the truth? Martin's eyes softened, but his voice remained measured. Yes, but not here. There are too many ears in these walls. He stood, moving to the window, looking out over the city, as if the past were written somewhere on its skyline. Come back tonight, he said, when it's dark. Bring that envelope. Grace nodded slowly, unsure whether she was stepping into danger or destiny. And as she left the tower, she didn't notice Alexander watching from the upper floor, his reflection warped against the glass, his jaw tight, his eyes filled with something colder than anger. Fear. The afternoon sun turned the windows of Sterling Tower into mirrors. From his corner office on the 60th floor, Alexander Sterling watched the city stretch beneath him like a conquered kingdom. His reflection stared back. Flawless suit, silver cufflinks, the face of control. But beneath the calm surface, something churned. He had spent the morning reading headlines about himself. Sterling fires waitress over shoes. It should have been nothing, a story that burned bright for a day, then vanished. Yet the public outrage refused to die. Reporters camped outside the building, employees whispered in elevators, and his PR team begged him to apologize. Alexander didn't do apologies. Let them be angry, he muttered. Scandal keeps my name in print. A soft knock broke his thoughts. Come in, he said. His assistant, a thin man named Travis, stepped in nervously. Sir, Mr. Hale's been in contact with the girl. The waitress. Alexander turned slowly. What did you say? She came to the building this morning. Security logged her name. Mr. Hale met with her personally. The blood drained from Alexander's face, replaced by a sharp, icy fury. He met with her? That woman should have been escorted off the property. Travis swallowed. Mr. Hale overruled me. He said it was confidential company business. Alexander's jaw tightened. Martin Hale had been his father's right hand for decades, loyal, measured, impossible to intimidate. But lately, Alexander had started to feel the man's quiet disapproval like a shadow at his back. And now, this? Meeting with a fired waitress? He turned to the window again. Find out everything about her. Family, employment, past addresses, everything. Yes, sir. When Travis left, Alexander poured himself a drink. The ice clinked softly against the glass, but his thoughts were loud, spiraling. He'd built his image on power, on perfection. A single waitress with worn-out shoes wasn't supposed to matter. Yet somehow she did. By the time evening fell, the Sterling Tower glowed against the skyline like a fortress of glass and light. Downstairs, Grace stood across the street, clutching her coat against the wind. She'd spent the afternoon replaying her conversation with Martin Hale, wondering if she'd imagined the urgency in his voice. The glass doors opened suddenly. Alexander stepped out, surrounded by two executives. His laughter carried through the night air, smooth, confident, cruel. He paused near his car, catching sight of Grace across the street. Their eyes met. His smile vanished. Grace froze, her heartbeat quickening. She didn't look away this time. Alexander handed his briefcase to one of the men and crossed the street. Couldn't stay away, huh? His tone was taunting. You really think a pity story will make me hire you back? Grace straightened. I'm not asking for a job. Then what do you want? The truth, she said quietly, about my mother. He laughed, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Your mother? What does she have to do with any of this? She worked for Sterling Group years ago. Her name was Evelyn Evans. Martin Hale knew her. For a moment, Alexander's confident mask slipped. That name again, he muttered, almost to himself. Grace stepped closer. Why does that scare you? He glared at her, the arrogance returning full force. Nothing scares me. But you're starting to irritate me. Leave before I make sure no company in this city ever hires you again. She stared at him, the humiliation of the gala flashing through her mind. But this time, the anger was stronger. Do whatever you want, she said. You can't stop what's already coming. He smirked, but she saw the tension in his jaw. Grace turned and walked away into the night, the envelope still safe inside her coat. Behind her, Alexander watched in silence, his reflection in the car window warping under the streetlight. For the first time in his life, the king of Sterling Group felt something unfamiliar crawl up his spine. Unease. And somewhere high above them, in the tower's top-floor office, Martin Hale stood in the dark, watching the entire exchange. His expression was unreadable, but his whisper carried through the empty room. Evelyn, your time has come. The next evening, the city was a glittering ocean of light. Sterling Group's charity gala was being broadcast live across half the country, a carefully curated spectacle meant to restore Alexander Sterling's image. The headlines calling him America's coldest CEO had bruised his ego, and tonight he planned to fix it. Cameras, champagne, and scripted generosity, the perfect redemption act. Grace didn't plan to attend. She had promised Martin Hale she'd come to his office at midnight to talk privately about her mother. But life has a way of forcing people into the scenes they most dread. At 7:00 p.m., a black car pulled up outside her apartment. The driver stepped out and handed her a small envelope. Inside was a silver invitation card, stamped with the Sterling logo, and a handwritten note. Come to the gala. Trust me. M.H. Her pulse quickened. Why there, of all places? Still, something in the way Martin had spoken earlier convinced her to go. She borrowed a simple black dress from her neighbor, brushed her hair, and hid her old shoes beneath the long hem. When she arrived at the Sterling Plaza ballroom, the air was thick with perfume and money. Chandeliers shimmered, violins played, and the elite mingled like a different species entirely. Grace felt invisible again, but this time she wasn't here to serve. Across the room, Alexander Sterling stood in front of a group of reporters wearing the same smug charm he'd weaponized all his life. Tonight, he announced, Sterling Group donates $10 million to the Children's Innovation Fund because leadership isn't about money, it's about responsibility. Applause rippled through the room. Cameras flashed. Grace wanted to walk away, but Martin Hale appeared beside her. He looked different tonight, tense, his usual calm replaced by something like resolve. "Why am I here?" she whispered. "Because truth only matters when people are watching," he said quietly. "Stay close. Don't say a word until I tell you to." Before she could respond, a waitress passed by, carrying a tray of wine glasses. The tray tipped slightly, spilling a few drops onto the floor right beside Alexander. He turned sharply. His voice, calm at first, cut through the music. "Watch where you're going," he snapped. "Do you people ever learn?" The woman stammered an apology, but Alexander's tone sharpened. "I swear, I can't go anywhere without being surrounded by incompetence." Grace saw it, history repeating itself. The crowd's laughter, the humiliation, the same cruel pattern. Something inside her snapped. "That's enough," she said, stepping forward. Every head turned. Alexander froze, recognition flickering across his face. "You again?" Grace stood her ground. "You fired me in this room for a pair of old shoes. You told the world I wasn't worth respect. But maybe the real problem isn't the people who serve you. It's the man who thinks he's untouchable." The silence that followed was electric. Reporters leaned in, cameras raised. Alexander laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "Is this your revenge? Crashing my event? You think anyone here cares about your little sob story?" Martin's voice carried from behind them, deep and steady. "Actually, I think they will." He stepped into the light, his presence commanding the room's attention. "Because this woman," he said, "has more right to be here than you do." Gasps swept through the crowd. Alexander spun toward him. "Martin, what are you doing?" "Finishing what your father started," Martin replied. "And ending what you've corrupted." Alexander's face drained of color. "You've lost your mind." Martin ignored him. "Tomorrow morning, the world will learn something you've spent your life hiding. But tonight they'll see the face of the woman who truly represents this company's legacy." He looked at Grace. "The truth will speak soon enough. Be ready." Alexander tried to laugh it off, but the tremor in his hands betrayed him. The cameras caught every second, the billionaire's smirk cracking for the first time. Grace didn't yet know what Martin meant, but as she stood in that blinding circle of light, surrounded by flashing bulbs and gasps of disbelief, she felt the shift in the air. For the first time, it wasn't her being humiliated, it was him. And the storm that would destroy his empire had just begun. Long after the guests had left, and the last camera light had faded, Martin Hale sat alone in his office, staring at an old photograph that had no right to still exist. In it, two young people stood side by side in front of a half-built skyscraper, the first Sterling Tower. The man was Richard Sterling, founder of the empire. The woman beside him, wearing a hard hat and a defiant smile, was Evelyn Evans, Grace's mother. Martin traced the edge of the photo with his thumb. He remembered the day vividly, the wind whipping at their coats, the smell of wet cement, Evelyn's laughter. He also remembered the day it all fell apart. The soft knock at the door broke his thoughts. "Come in," he said. Grace stepped in quietly, still wearing the borrowed black dress from the gala. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. "You said you'd tell me everything." Martin gestured for her to sit. "You deserve that much." He poured 2 cups of coffee, set one in front of her, then leaned back in his chair. "Your mother wasn't just an employee here. She built this company with Richard Sterling. They were partners, brilliant, unstoppable, and inseparable." Grace frowned. "Partners? But all the records say Richard founded Sterling Group alone." "That's what his son made sure people believed," Martin said quietly. "Evelyn designed the early projects, secured the first investors, even named the company. But she was written out, erased from history, when she refused to marry him." Grace blinked. "Refused?" Martin nodded. "Richard loved her. Everyone knew it. But he was married already, trapped in a corporate arrangement his father forced on him. When Evelyn discovered she was pregnant, with you, she wanted nothing from him except to be left in peace. She took a payout, signed a confidentiality agreement, and disappeared. I was the only one who knew where she went. Grace's breath caught. So you knew about me all this time? I did, but she made me promise never to contact you unless it was necessary. When she died, I honored that, until I saw you at the gala. When I saw your face, it was like seeing hers again. She stared at him, tears threatening. Then why didn't you stop him? You stood there and watched Alexander fire me. Martin's eyes hardened. Because he needed to reveal who he truly was, before I revealed who you are. Grace shook her head slowly, overwhelmed. You said my mother helped build this company. What happened to her shares? Martin opened a drawer and pulled out a file. Inside was a document stamped Confidential Transfer Agreement. She never sold them. The papers everyone saw were forgeries. I've kept the originals for 25 years. He slid the document across the desk. Grace hesitated before picking it up. There, in black ink, were the words that made her hands tremble. Evelyn Evans, 51% ownership. Her voice came out as a whisper. That can't be real. It's real, Martin said firmly. She gave me power of attorney to protect it until you were ready. The company has been yours since the day she died. Grace felt her pulse race. You mean, I own Sterling Group? You are Sterling Group, Martin said. And tomorrow, we make it official. She stared down at the papers, the truth sinking in like cold water. Her mother hadn't been powerless. She had been silenced. Martin stood and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Evelyn wanted justice, not revenge. Whatever happens next, remember that. Grace nodded, tears finally falling. I don't want revenge, she whispered. I just want my mother's name back. Martin smiled sadly. Then we'll give it to her. And as dawn began to break over the city, the man who once built an Emma for the Sterlings prepared to hand it back to the woman they had erased, and to her daughter, who would finish what her mother started. Martin Hale hadn't slept. The city was still half asleep when he stood by the tall windows of his penthouse, coffee in hand, watching dawn paint the skyline in streaks of gold and grey. Every decision he'd ever made in his 35 years at Sterling Group was calculated, methodical. But this one felt different. This one could end him. His phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Alexander Sterling. Board meeting at 9. Be ready to explain last night's stunt. Martin smirked. Stunt, he muttered. You have no idea what's coming. He turned toward the table where Evelyn's file lay open. Grace's inheritance, her mother's legacy, and his final act of loyalty. He'd kept those papers hidden through mergers, audits, and board takeovers, always waiting for the right moment. He just hadn't expected that moment to arrive wearing her mother's face. The intercom crackled. Mr. Hale, Miss Evans is here. Send her up. Moments later, Grace stepped inside, dressed simply but with quiet confidence. Her hair was tied back, her eyes steady. She didn't look like the frightened waitress from the gala anymore. She looked like someone who had decided to stop running. Martin gestured toward the seat across from him. We have one chance to do this right, he said. The board meets in a few hours. Alexander doesn't know about your mother's shares yet, but he suspects something. Once we go public, there's no turning back. Grace sat down, folding her hands in her lap. What happens if we lose? Then we both go down, Martin said honestly. He'll bury us under legal battles, drag your mother's name through the mud, and make sure you never set foot in this city again. Grace took a slow breath. Then we can't lose. Martin studied her. You sound like your mother. She smiled faintly. I wouldn't know, but if she fought for this company once, I'll do the same. Martin poured her a cup of coffee. Alexander's power comes from perception. The board follows him because they think he's untouchable. You don't have to destroy him. You just have to show them that he's not a god. Grace nodded. So we tell them the truth? Yes, Martin said, but the truth needs timing. He handed her a folder. Inside were photographs, letters, and the original ownership documents. This is your proof. When I announce the review of the founding records, you step forward and claim what's yours. Grace flipped through the papers, her hands trembling slightly. What if they don't believe me? Martin's gaze softened. They will. Because you're not doing this for money or fame. You're doing it for dignity. And that's something Alexander can't fake. He paused, then added quietly. Evelyn once told me, justice takes time, but truth doesn't age. I think she'd want you to remember that. Grace nodded slowly, committing the words to memory. Then let's do this. As she stood, Martin's phone rang again. He glanced at the caller ID. Alexander. He ignored it. The sound of the phone buzzing over and over filled the silence like a warning bell. Finally, he turned to Grace. He'll come for me first. He knows I'm the only one who could expose him. If anything happens, if he tries to stop the meeting, don't wait. You walk into that boardroom and show them who you are. Grace hesitated. You really think he'd hurt you? Martin gave a tired smile. I've known Alexander since he was a boy. His father taught him to win at any cost. He doesn't know any other way. She met his gaze. Then it's time, he learned. Martin exhaled, the faintest trace of pride in his voice. Evelyn would be proud of you. Grace looked toward the sunrise beyond the glass, its reflection catching the edge of the file that held her mother's name. And as the light spread over the city, Martin knew the truth he'd hidden for 25 years was finally ready to see daylight, no matter what it destroyed. By mid-morning, the wind cut through Manhattan like glass. Grace stood on the corner outside Sterling Tower, her breath clouding in the cold air, clutching the folder that held her mother's truth. Cars rushed past, indifferent. Above her, the tower loomed, steel, glass, and arrogance. She was supposed to walk through those doors and claim her place. Instead, she hesitated. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Unknown number. Hello? Miss Evans, a voice said, smooth and confident. This is Alexander Sterling. Her stomach dropped. How did you get my number? He chuckled. Please, there's nothing I can't get. Listen, before you embarrass yourself, I'd like to offer you a chance to walk away. Grace gripped the folder tighter. I'm not walking away. You should, he said. You have no idea what game you've stepped into. Martin Hale is a liar. Whatever he told you, it's not real. You're being used. She took a steadying breath. You're scared, aren't you? There was a pause, then a low laugh. Scared? Of a waitress in thrift store shoes? No, Miss Evans, I'm warning you. When people challenge me, they end up wishing they hadn't. Grace hung up before he could finish. Her hands shook, but not from fear, rage. Inside the tower, the lobby guards blocked her way. Ma'am, you're not authorized to enter, one of them said. Tell Martin Hale I'm here for the meeting. The guard checked his earpiece, then frowned. Mr. Hale's not in the building. He left about an hour ago. His car's missing. What? Grace's voice wavered. Missing. The guard shrugged. No one's heard from him. A chill deeper than the winter air settled in her chest. She stepped back onto the sidewalk, the city noise rushing around her. Martin had warned her. If something happened to him, she had to move forward alone. Her phone buzzed again. A text. Stay away from Sterling Group. For your own safety. No name. Grace's heart pounded as she started walking, faster and faster, until she reached the bus stop near Lexington. She sank onto the bench, the folder clutched in her lap. The world around her blurred. Voices, footsteps, horns. It all faded into a hollow hum. Her thoughts spun in chaotic loops. What if Martin was gone? What if Alexander had already destroyed the evidence? What if she was truly alone? Then her phone rang again. This time, it was the hospital. Miss Evans, this is St. Luke's. Your grandmother was brought in this morning, respiratory distress. She's stable for now, but you should come. Grace felt the ground tilt beneath her. I'll be there. She rushed across town, her mind a storm of panic. When she reached the hospital, Eleanor lay pale and fragile beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, oxygen mask fogging with each breath. "Grandma," Grace whispered, taking her hand. Eleanor opened her eyes faintly. "You look tired, baby." "I'm okay," Grace said, though her voice broke. "You just rest." The nurse approached quietly. "She needs medication soon, but your insurance—" Grace's throat tightened. "I'll find the money." When the nurse left, Eleanor's hand squeezed hers weakly. "Your mother, she believed in doing the right thing, even when it hurt." Grace nodded, tears streaming. "I'm trying, Grandma. I really am." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Then don't stop." Outside the window, snow began to fall, soft and silent. Grace sat beside the hospital bed until dusk, her mind drifting between fear and resolve. Martin might be gone. Alexander might be powerful. But she had her mother's signature, the truth, and a reason to fight that ran deeper than revenge. She looked at the folder on her lap, the papers glowing faintly under the sterile light. And as the snow thickened outside, Grace whispered to herself, "They took everything from my mother. I won't let them take me too." The hospital corridor smelled faintly of bleach and hopelessness. Grace leaned against the vending machine, staring at the phone in her hand. Still no word from Martin Hale. It had been more than 12 hours since he vanished. She'd tried calling, texting. Nothing. Only silence. She looked through the narrow window of her grandmother's room. Eleanor was asleep, her breathing steady under the oxygen mask. Grace's chest tightened. If she lost her too, she'd have no one left. Her phone buzzed suddenly. An unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Hello?" "Miss Evans," said a calm male voice. "Mr. Hale asked me to contact you." Grace's heart jumped. "Is he okay? Where is he?" "He's safe," the voice replied, "but time is running out. He asked me to give you something." The man gave her an address, an old office building on the west side, and hung up before she could ask more. 30 minutes later, Grace stepped off the bus into the cold. The building looked abandoned, its windows dusted with grime. Inside, a single light glowed behind a glass door marked Hale Consulting. A man in a grey suit greeted her. He looked cautious but professional. "You're Grace Evans?" "Yes, you said you work for Mr. Hale." He nodded, locking the door behind her. He anticipated this. He knew Alexander might try to stop him before the board meeting. He left instructions. Grace followed him to a table covered with files and a sleek silver laptop. On the screen was a pre-recorded video. Martin Hale's face appeared, tired but determined. "Grace," the recording began, his voice low and steady. "If you're seeing this, I couldn't reach the meeting. You'll have to do it without me." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "I've placed every piece of proof you'll need in this folder," he continued. "Your mother's partnership agreement, the share transfer documents, even the audio recordings from the original board meetings. Alexander forged records to erase her, but the originals are here. You must bring them to tomorrow's board session. Once they're presented, the truth becomes irreversible." Martin paused, his gaze softening. "Evelyn trusted me with her legacy. Now I trust you. Don't let him intimidate you. The board respects power, not pity. When you walk in, do it as Evelyn's daughter, not as a waitress who was fired, but as the rightful owner of Sterling Group." The screen went black. Grace sat in silence for a moment, staring at her reflection on the dark monitor. The weight of everything, the fear, the loss, the responsibility, settled heavy in her chest. The man in the grey suit handed her a sealed envelope. "Mr. Hale said this was personal." Inside was a photograph of Martin, Evelyn, and a newborn baby in a hospital blanket. Her. Written on the back, in Evelyn's handwriting, were 3 words. For truth, always. Grace closed her eyes. Thank you. The man nodded. Be careful, Miss Evans. Sterling's people are watching. He knows something's coming. Outside, the city lights flickered in the distance like tiny fires. Grace walked toward the bus stop, the folder clutched to her chest. Every step felt heavier, but her pace never faltered. By the time she returned to the hospital, the night had deepened. She slipped quietly into her grandmother's room. Eleanor stirred and whispered, Gracie, you found what you were looking for. Grace smiled faintly. Not yet, but I will. Her grandmother squeezed her hand weakly. Then do it for her, for your mother. Grace nodded. For her, she said softly. As she sat there watching Eleanor sleep, she opened the folder one last time, her eyes tracing the signatures that carried her mother's name beside the Sterling seal. And for the first time, Grace didn't feel like an outsider in their world. She was walking into the lion's den, but this time, she wasn't prey. She was the heir. The next morning dawned grey and heavy, the kind of sky that warned of a storm. Grace stood in front of the mirror in her apartment, tightening the small silver necklace her mother had left her. The reflection staring back wasn't the timid waitress who had been fired in front of hundreds of people. It was a woman who'd seen the truth and couldn't unsee it. The folder lay on the kitchen table, perfectly aligned, every document inside neatly ordered. The proof, her mother's name, her mother's handwriting, her legacy. Grace had read them a dozen times through the night, each time with growing disbelief. Evelyn Evans wasn't a forgotten employee. She had been half of the empire. Her phone buzzed. It was an email from Sterling Group. Subject, board meeting rescheduled, 10 a.m. Sharp. She felt her stomach twist. He knows. By the time she reached the building, the lobby was buzzing with reporters. Cameras flashed, voices shouted. Grace kept her head down, clutching the folder like armor. A security guard recognized her immediately. Miss Evans? His tone was cautious now, not dismissive. Mr. Sterling requested you be escorted upstairs. Of course he did, she muttered. The elevator ride felt endless. When the doors opened, Alexander Sterling was waiting. No press, no board members. Just him, standing at the head of the long glass conference table like a king guarding his throne. Grace Evans, he said smoothly, as if her name tasted foreign. You've been busy. Grace walked in slowly. I have something that belongs to me, or rather, something that belongs to my mother. He smirked, hands tucked into his pockets. Let me guess. Martin Hale's little bedtime story. It's not a story, Grace said. She set the folder on the table and opened it, spreading the papers like a dealer laying down a royal flush. It's proof. Alexander leaned forward, scanning the pages. His smirk didn't fade, but his eyes darkened. Partnership agreement, ownership transfer, sealed signatures, he read aloud, his tone casual but brittle. You actually think this makes you an heir? Grace crossed her arms. It's all here. My mother was co-founder of Sterling Group. That means her shares passed to me. He chuckled, low and cruel. You're holding forged documents, sweetheart. Whatever fairy tale Hale sold you, it ends here. Grace met his gaze without blinking. Then call your lawyers. Verify the signatures. But you already know they're real, don't you? For the first time, his confidence cracked, a small twitch at the corner of his jaw. Listen carefully, he said, lowering his voice. You have no idea what you're getting into. My father built this empire. My name built its reputation. You, he pointed at her, you're a nobody who served cocktails and thinks she can rewrite history because of a few dusty papers. Grace took a step closer. Your father didn't build this alone. He stole it. My mother was the mind behind the foundation plans, the one who secured the investors, The one your father buried when she wouldn't play by his rules. You've been living off her work your entire life." He slammed his hand against the table. The sound echoed through the empty room. "Get out." Grace flinched but didn't move. "No." Alexander's breathing quickened. "You're making a mistake. Walk away, and I'll make this disappear. Stay, and I'll destroy you." Grace stared at him, her mother's words from Martin's recording replaying in her head. "Justice takes time, but truth doesn't age." "I'm not walking away," she said softly. "Not this time." For a long moment they stood in silence, the tyrant and the heiress he didn't know existed. Finally, Alexander's voice came out cold. "Then you'd better be ready for war." Grace gathered the papers, slid them back into the folder, and turned toward the door. Her hands were trembling, but her steps were steady, and as the door closed behind her, Alexander stared after her. His reflection in the glass, warped and uncertain. For the first time in his life, the man who thought he owned everything realized something he couldn't control, had just walked out with his father's sins in her hands. By the next morning, the rumor had spread through every floor of Sterling Group like wildfire. Employees whispered in elevators, executives traded looks in glass-walled offices. No one knew exactly what was happening, only that something, or someone, was threatening the empire. Alexander Sterling sat behind his desk, staring at his reflection in the dark glass window. He hadn't slept. The city below looked small and harmless, but his grip on it was slipping. For the first time in his career, people were questioning him. Travis, his nervous assistant, hovered in the doorway. "Sir, the board meeting is in 1 hour. Everyone's asking what it's about. Should I tell them it's a standard financial review?" Alexander's voice was calm but sharp. "Tell them it's about control." "Yes, sir." As Travis left, Alexander loosened his tie and exhaled. He could feel the walls closing in. Grace Evans, the missing Martin Hale, the whispers of forged documents. If the board even suspected there was truth to it, they could demand a vote of confidence. He couldn't let that happen. His phone buzzed, a private message. Board members arriving, press waiting outside. He muttered to himself, "Let them wait. I'll bury this before lunch." Across town, Grace stood in front of her bathroom mirror, heart pounding. She was wearing a grey suit borrowed from her neighbor, slightly too big at the shoulders, but it made her feel braver. The folder was tucked under her arm, its edges worn from her grip. In her phone, the pre-recorded message from Martin Hale waited, just in case. His last words echoed in her head. "When you walk in, remember, you are your mother's voice, now." She took a deep breath and whispered to the reflection, "You've got this." When she arrived at the building, the street was chaos. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed. She pushed through them, ignoring the noise. Inside the lobby, a group of executives paused mid-conversation as she passed. The looks were mixed: confusion, disbelief, a few flickers of sympathy. The receptionist hesitated. "Miss Evans, Mr. Sterling asked for you to wait in the conference room." Grace nodded. "I won't be long." Upstairs, the boardroom buzzed with tension. 12 members sat around the gleaming table, murmuring among themselves. At the head, Alexander stood tall, his smile polished but strained. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we're here to address a small misunderstanding that's been circulating. A disgruntled former employee has made certain allegations about our company's ownership. I want to assure you, it's nonsense." The board members exchanged wary glances. He continued, "This woman, Grace Evans, claims to have proof that her late mother owned shares of Sterling Group. Of course, it's a fabrication. Documents forged by a man with his own agenda, Martin Hale. Unfortunately, he's gone missing, which tells you everything you need to know about his credibility." He smirked slightly. "If she dares show up today, I'll give her a chance to present her little story. Then we'll put this rumor to bed permanently." Just then, the doors opened. Grace stepped inside, calm and steady, the folder in her hands. The room fell silent. Even the sound of the city beyond the glass walls seemed to fade. Alexander turned toward her, his expression a mix of contempt and unease. "Speak of the devil." Grace walked to the center of the room and placed the folder on the table. "You wanted proof. Here it is." A murmur rippled through the board members. Alexander's smile faltered for a split second before he recovered. "This is highly irregular." Grace met his eyes. "So is erasing the woman who built half your company." The room erupted in whispers. Cameras from the internal media team began recording. Alexander clenched his jaw. Grace took a breath. "You can try to silence me, but the truth doesn't vanish just because you say so. Today the world will see who really owns Sterling Group." And as she sat down across from him, the board members leaning in with growing curiosity, Alexander realized for the first time that he might not be able to talk his way out of this one. The kingdom he'd built on lies was about to face its reckoning. The boardroom was thick with tension. Grace sat perfectly still, her hands folded on the folder before her. Across the table, Alexander Sterling's confident mask was starting to crack, though he fought to keep the smirk alive. "All right," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Let's hear your fairy tale, Miss Evans." Grace opened the folder and slid a document forward. "This is a partnership agreement signed 30 years ago between Evelyn Evans and Richard Sterling. Your father—" Alexander barely glanced at it. "Forgery." One of the board members, an older man named Harrington, adjusted his glasses. "That's a strong accusation. The signature looks authentic." Grace met his eyes. "It is. And this," she held up another paper, "is a transfer of ownership, giving Evelyn Evans 51% of Sterling Group in the event of Richard Sterling's death." A ripple of shock passed through the room. Even those loyal to Alexander exchanged uneasy looks. Alexander laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You think walking in here with a few papers will undo decades of leadership? You have no idea how this world works." Grace's voice was calm, but her eyes burned. "I know exactly how it works. My mother helped build this company, and your family buried her. You've lived off her work, her ideas, her silence. That ends today." The room fell quiet again. Someone coughed softly. Alexander stood, his tone turning condescending. "You want to play corporate hero? Fine. But this isn't a movie, Miss Evans. No one here is going to hand you a company because you have sentimental paperwork." Grace took a deep breath, her pulse steady. "You're right. I don't expect anyone to hand me anything. I'm not asking for power. I'm reclaiming what was stolen." Her voice carried differently now, controlled, confident. Even the board could feel it. Alexander turned to the others. "You see what this is? A performance. A scam orchestrated by Martin Hale. And conveniently, he's vanished." Grace reached into her folder and placed a USB drive on the table. "He vanished because of you." Alexander's eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "This," she said, "is a recording. Martin made it the night before he disappeared. He knew you'd try to bury him too." She nodded to one of the board members near the monitor. The man hesitated, then inserted the drive. The screen flickered, and Martin Hale's face appeared, tired, wary, but resolute. His recorded voice filled the room. "If you're watching this, it means Alexander Sterling has crossed a line. I've kept Evelyn Evans's documents hidden for 25 years to protect her daughter, Grace Evans. The truth is simple. She owns the majority of this company. I've seen the proof. I've verified every signature myself. And if you're hearing this, it means Alexander tried to stop me." The room went dead silent. Alexander's face drained of color. "This is manipulation." "Enough," Harrington said sharply. "This is serious, Alexander." Grace stood slowly. "The only manipulation here is the one your family's been running for decades." Alexander slammed his hand on the table. "You don't belong here." Grace met his rage with calm. "Neither did my mother, but she stayed anyway. She built this from nothing. And unlike you, she didn't need to crush people to prove she was powerful." The board members were whispering now, murmuring words like audit, ownership, vote. Grace gathered the papers back into her folder and stood tall. "Tomorrow, I'll present these documents to the court and the media. You can keep denying the truth, but the world will know who I am and what this company really stands for." As she walked towards the door, Alexander called after her, his voice shaking. "You'll regret this, Evans. You don't know what I'm capable of." She paused, glancing back at him over her shoulder. "No," she said softly. "You don't know what I'm capable of." And when she stepped into the hallway, the reflection in the glass didn't show a waitress anymore. It showed the woman her mother had raised her to be, strong, unbroken, and ready for war. A week later, the Sterling Group hosted its annual Investors' Gala, an event Alexander Sterling had designed to prove to the world that nothing could shake his empire. The ballroom of the Metropolitan Grand glowed with gold and crystal, the kind of place where money didn't just buy power, it defined it. Alexander stood before the cameras, charming and untouchable again, or at least pretending to be. "Sterling Group has always represented excellence," he told the crowd, "and despite recent rumors spread by those seeking attention, our foundation remains unbreakable." The audience applauded, but it was hesitant, polite. The whispers about the waitress, the missing CEO, and the mysterious partnership agreement hadn't faded. They'd spread. Investors didn't forget scandal. They waited for proof. Backstage, Grace Evans watched the broadcast on a small monitor. She wore a white suit that fit perfectly this time, tailored to her frame, her mother's silver necklace glinting against her collar. Every part of her wanted to walk away, to vanish back into the quiet life she knew. But she could still hear Martin's voice in her head. "You are your mother's voice now." She took one last breath, clutching the folder in her hand. The same folder that had burned a hole through Alexander's confidence. Tonight, she wasn't just here to reclaim her mother's name. She was here to end the lie once and for all. The MC's voice rang through the ballroom. "Please welcome our CEO, Mr. Alexander Sterling, for the signing of this year's partnership renewal." Alexander approached the glass podium, pen in hand, all smiles for the cameras. "Sterling Group stands for legacy. Our family's promise to this country that hard work and vision." The ballroom doors opened, heads turned, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Grace Evans stepped inside, the sound of her heels echoing against marble. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Even the cameras froze on her face. The girl from the viral video, the one he'd humiliated in front of the world. Alexander's smile faltered. "What is this?" he hissed under his breath. Grace walked forward, calm, steady. "You said Sterling Group was about legacy," she said, her voice clear through the microphone. "I agree. It's time everyone knows whose legacy this really is." The audience shifted uneasily. Reporters leaned forward, recognizing her instantly. Alexander forced a laugh. "Security, please escort this woman out. She's trespassing again." Grace ignored him and opened the folder, placing the documents on the podium beside him. "I'm not trespassing," she said. "I'm home." Gasps rippled through the crowd. "These are the original ownership papers signed by Richard Sterling and my mother, Evelyn Evans," Grace continued. "My mother co-founded this company. When she died, her shares passed to me. That means I own 51% of Sterling Group." The room erupted into chaos. Flashbulbs exploded, investors began shouting questions, and Alexander's face drained of color. "Forgery!" he barked. "She's lying!" Grace turned to the nearest reporter. "Then let him prove it." She looked back at Alexander. "Show them your father's originals. Show them what you've been hiding for 30 years. He opened his mouth, but no words came. From the crowd, someone called out, "Is that true, Alexander? Did your father have a partner?" The silence that followed was the longest of his life. His jaw clenched, his eyes darting toward the cameras, and that hesitation was all the proof anyone needed. Grace looked at him, voice steady, but soft. "You could have told the truth. You could have honored her. But instead, you chose to humiliate me, just like your father humiliated her." She turned to the cameras, her gaze unwavering. "My name is Grace Evelyn Evans. daughter of the woman who built Sterling Group. And tonight, I'm taking back what she created. The applause started slowly. 1, then 2, then the entire room. Investors rose to their feet. Cameras flashed brighter than ever. Alexander stood frozen, pale and furious, trapped in the spotlight he'd once owned. And as Grace stepped onto the stage beside him, the cameras catching every second, the empire that had been built on lies finally began to crumble under the weight of truth. The ballroom had become a battlefield. Cameras flashed like lightning, microphones thrust forward, reporters shouting over one another. Alexander Sterling stood frozen at the podium, his perfect composure finally breaking. The audience, investors, politicians, journalists, watched in stunned silence as Grace Evans held the proof of everything he had tried to bury. "This is absurd," Alexander said finally, his voice rising above the noise. "This woman is delusional. None of this is legally binding." Grace didn't flinch. "Then you won't mind if the press reviews the signatures, will you?" He slammed his hand against the podium, his voice sharp. "This is my company. My name built this empire." Grace's tone was calm, almost pitying. "Your name was built on her silence, my mother's silence." She lifted one of the documents so the crowd could see the faded ink. "This isn't a rumor. It's a contract. Her contract. And your father signed it." Alexander turned toward the board members, seated near the front. "Gentlemen, you know this is a scam. You've known me my entire career. Do you really think I'd let something like this slip through?" The board shifted uncomfortably. Harrington, the senior member, adjusted his glasses. "Alexander, if those documents are authentic, then we have a serious issue. We need to verify them immediately." "Authentic?" Alexander barked. "You're taking her word over mine?" Grace's voice cut through his outrage like a blade. "Maybe they've realized your word doesn't mean much anymore." The crowd murmured. Alexander took a step closer to her, lowering his voice. "You think you've won something here, don't you? You have no idea how deep this goes. Every lawyer, every judge, every investor, they're all on my side. You're just a girl with a piece of paper." Grace held his gaze, her pulse steady. "You're right," she said. "I'm just a girl with a piece of paper. But that paper happens to say, I own you." The audience gasped. Someone shouted, "Is that true?" Grace stepped back from the podium and looked directly into the nearest camera. "For years, the Sterling family has profited from lies. They erased my mother, Evelyn Evans, from history because she refused to be controlled. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. The documents are public now. Every reporter in this room has a copy." The sound of phones pinging filled the air as her email hit inboxes across the room. Alexander's face turned white. "You didn't," he said, almost whispering. "I did," Grace replied. "Every piece of evidence, contracts, recordings, Martin Hale's testimony, it's all been sent to the press." Reporters surged forward, shouting questions. "Mr. Sterling, did your father forge the records? Is it true she owns 51% of the company? Will you step down?" Alexander stumbled back, his voice cracking under the weight of it. "You'll regret this, Grace. You're destroying everything your mother worked for." "No," she said quietly. "I'm saving it from you." The crowd erupted again. Flashbulbs, voices, chaos. Grace turned to Harrington and the board. "You all have a choice now. Keep protecting a man who built his fortune on deceit, or honor the woman who actually built this company." Harrington nodded slowly. "We'll convene immediately." Alexander lunged forward, but security stepped between them. His voice turned desperate. "You don't understand. She's manipulating you. She's nothing." Grace looked at him, sadness flickering behind her steady expression. "I used to believe that too. But you made one mistake. You forgot that people remember how you make them feel. And today, they're seeing you for who you really are." She turned to leave the stage as the cameras followed her every step. Behind her, Alexander shouted something incoherent, drowned out by the roar of the crowd. And in that moment, under the blinding lights and flashing cameras, the mighty Alexander Sterling realized he'd lost not just his company, but the one thing his power could never buy back: respect. The next morning, the news exploded across every network in America. Sterling empire shattered by ownership scandal. Waitress turns out to be majority shareholder. Alexander Sterling under investigation for fraud. Grace watched the coverage from a quiet cafe near Central Park. The city buzzed around her, but inside, everything felt strangely still. The noise of victory was loud outside, yet inside her chest there was only a calm ache. It wasn't triumph. It was justice finally exhaling after years of silence. Her phone vibrated. A call from Harrington. She hesitated, then answered. "Miss Evans," he said. "The board held an emergency session this morning. The evidence you provided checks out. Every document is authentic, every signature verified." Grace gripped her coffee cup. "So it's official?" "Yes," he said. "You're the rightful owner of 51% of Sterling Group. Effective immediately, Alexander Sterling has been removed as CEO." The vote was unanimous. Grace didn't speak for a moment. She just let the words hang in the air, heavy and unreal. "Thank you," she said finally. "Not for me, for my mother." Harrington's voice softened. "She must have been an extraordinary woman." "She was," Grace whispered. After hanging up, she sat in silence, staring out at the park where people walked their dogs and jogged past as if the world hadn't just shifted. She thought about her mother, how Evelyn Evans had fought for fairness in a world that had no place for women like her. Grace had spent years ashamed of her struggles, of her old shoes, of being small in a world built by men like Alexander. Now she understood that being underestimated was her greatest weapon. Across town, Alexander Sterling sat alone in his penthouse office for the last time. The space that had once made him feel invincible now looked empty, hollow. Stacks of legal folders covered his desk. His reflection stared back at him from the black glass window. Pale and exhausted, Travis entered quietly. "Sir, the board's decision is final. Security's waiting to escort you out." Alexander didn't turn around. "Do they know who I am?" he said softly. Travis hesitated. "Yes, sir. That's why they're not waiting any longer." Alexander gave a short, bitter laugh. "I built this place. Every floor, every deal, every dollar." "You inherited it," Travis said before catching himself. "I mean, sir, I'm sorry." Alexander finally turned, his eyes cold and distant. "Get out." When Travis left, Alexander's composure cracked. He walked to the wall where a framed photograph of his father hung. Richard Sterling shaking hands with governors and billionaires. Beneath the photo, the company's motto, "Strength through legacy." He whispered bitterly, "Strength through theft." His phone buzzed again. Dozens of missed calls, reporters, lawyers, investors fleeing. The empire was collapsing in real time. Then another call came in. Unknown number. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Mr. Sterling," came Grace's calm voice. "You don't have to keep fighting. It's over." He froze. "You think this is mercy, Grace? Taking everything from me?" "I didn't take anything that wasn't already mine," she said softly. "You can still walk away with dignity. That's more than you gave anyone else." He didn't respond. For a long moment, there was only silence. Finally, he whispered, "She was your mother. She should have been mine too." Grace's voice broke, but she kept it steady. "Then you should have honored her." She ended the call before he could speak again. In the reflection of the glass, Alexander saw himself clearly for the first time. Not a titan, not a king, just a man who had built his throne on lies. The weight of it crushed him. And as the sun set over the city, the mighty Alexander Sterling sat in his empty office, surrounded by everything he'd ever wanted, and realized he'd lost the only thing that ever mattered, his name. The winter sun hung low over Manhattan, pale and distant, as if even it needed a moment to rest after the chaos. Grace stood inside the Sterling Group boardroom, the same room where she had once been humiliated, the same room where her mother's name had been erased. But now, that name hung proudly on the digital display above the table. Evelyn Evans, co-founder and visionary. The board members filed out one by one, offering her quiet congratulations. Harrington stopped before leaving. "Miss Evans, we'll have the new leadership documents finalized by the end of the week. The company is officially yours." Grace smiled faintly. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington, but I don't want it just to be mine. I want it to mean something again." He nodded with respect. "Then it's in the right hands." When the door closed, the silence of the room pressed around her. The skyline stretched beyond the glass, cold and endless, the same view her mother must have once stared at and dreamed of changing. She walked slowly to the head of the table and rested her hand on the leather chair. For a long time, she didn't move. The memory of her mother's laughter, the one from the old photo Martin had given her, echoed softly in her mind. "Mom," she whispered, "we did it." A quiet knock interrupted the moment. Grace turned. Martin Hale stood in the doorway, alive but visibly frail, his arm in a sling, a faint bruise across his temple. Grace's eyes widened. "Martin?" He smiled tiredly. "You didn't think a car crash would take me out that easily, did you?" She ran to him, emotion breaking through the composure she'd fought to maintain. "I thought you were gone." "I almost was," he said, easing into a chair. "Alexander made sure of that. But the police have him now. His confession came faster than I expected." Grace sank into the seat across from him, tears welling in her eyes. "You shouldn't have risked your life for this." Martin shook his head. "I made a promise to your mother. I couldn't die before keeping it." Grace reached across the table and took his hand. "You did more than keep it. You gave me back my family." He smiled softly. "Your mother was special. She believed power meant nothing if it didn't help people. You have that same fire, Grace. Don't lose it trying to play their game." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I don't want revenge. I want to rebuild this place the way she would have wanted. Fairness, dignity, opportunity for people who never got a chance." "That," Martin said, "sounds like something worth fighting for." For a long time, they sat in quiet understanding. Outside, snow began to drift past the windows, soft and slow, painting the city in white. Grace looked toward the skyline. "I used to think the world was built by people like Alexander, ruthless, invincible. But now I know it's the people who keep standing back up that actually hold it together." Martin chuckled lightly. "Then it's your world now." Grace smiled. "No, it's my mother's world. I'm just finally living in it." He nodded approvingly. "Then she'd be proud." Grace turned toward the window again, watching the city lights flicker through the snow. For the first time, she didn't feel like an outsider looking in. She belonged here, not because of the title, or the company, or the money, but because she had turned pain into purpose. And as the first flakes of snow settled on the glass, Grace Evans, once a waitress in worn-out shoes, finally felt the warmth of something greater than victory. Peace. For a few quiet weeks, the world seemed to settle. The chaos that had engulfed Sterling Group began to fade into headlines of triumph and transformation. The media called it the redemption of Grace Evans. Investors returned. Employees smiled again in the hallways. For the first time in decades, the company felt alive. But peace, as Grace soon learned, was never permanent. It started with a whisper, an anonymous email forwarded to her assistant. The subject line read, "Internal concern, financial misconduct." Grace opened it, expecting another leftover mess from Alexander's reign. What she found made her stomach tighten. The email contained a confidential transaction log. Several large sums of company money, millions, had been quietly diverted into a private account under a shell company named Halcyon Holdings. The authorization code? It bore the initials H. Martin Hale. Grace reread it 3 times, her heart thudding in her chest. She didn't want to believe it. He had risked everything to protect her mother's legacy. He had nearly died doing it. But the evidence on the screen didn't care about feelings. Her assistant, nervous, asked, "Should I alert the finance team?" Grace shook her head quickly. "No, not yet." That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat in her office long after everyone had gone home, the city lights flickering below like silent witnesses. She replayed every conversation she'd ever had with Martin, searching for a sign, any sign, that he might have betrayed her. Around midnight, the office door opened. Martin stepped in, still in his coat, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You're still here," he said softly. Grace forced a smile, hiding the tremor in her hands. "Couldn't sleep." He set the cup in front of her. "Neither could I. These board transitions are brutal." She studied him carefully. "Martin, can I ask you something?" He took a seat. "Of course." She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the coffee cup. "Were you ever involved with a company called Halcyon Holdings?" For a split second, so quick she almost missed it, something flickered across his face. A shadow. Then he recovered. "Where did you hear that?" "I got an email," she said quietly. It listed transfers. Money missing from Sterling Group. Millions. Martin's expression hardened. "Grace, there are people who want to tear you down. You've made enemies in high places. They'll forge anything to make you doubt the people who care about you." She wanted to believe him. She really did. "Then you're saying it's fake?" He looked her in the eye. "Yes." But something in his tone didn't match the certainty of his words. Grace leaned back, her mind spinning. "You told me once my mother believed truth doesn't age. I need to know if that still applies." Martin sighed, rubbing his temples. "You sound just like her." "That's the point," Grace said softly. "She trusted you. I did too. Please tell me I'm not wrong." He stood suddenly, pushing the chair back. "I've done everything I could for you, Grace. Everything. Don't throw it away over some anonymous email." His voice cracked with anger. Or was it fear? She couldn't tell. He turned to leave, but she spoke again, quietly. "If it's not true, you won't mind if I open an audit tomorrow." He froze at the door. For a long moment, he didn't say a word. Then, without turning around, he muttered, "Do what you have to do." When he left, the silence in the room felt heavier than before. Grace stared at the untouched coffee cup and the reflection of the city lights in the glass. And as she closed the email window, she realized something painful. Sometimes the hardest truth isn't the one you uncover, it's the one you hoped you'd never have to. Morning came heavy with doubt. Grace had barely slept, her mind looping through fragments of Martin's voice, her mother's words, and the numbers on that damning spreadsheet. She wanted to dismiss it all as sabotage, a desperate ploy by one of Alexander's old allies. But the look in Martin's eyes last night had been enough to fracture her certainty. When she arrived at Sterling Tower, the mood in the building was different. The whispers were back. Employees looked away as she passed. Her assistant rushed up with a folder. "Miss Evans, the auditors are here. They say the financial discrepancies are real." Grace stopped walking. "How real?" 47 million, the assistant whispered. "Moved into offshore accounts over the past 6 months. Every authorization bears Martin Hale's signature." Grace's knees nearly buckled. She had called for the audit only 12 hours ago. The speed of the findings told her the rot had been there long before she'd taken over. She took the elevator to the top floor, each floor's chime cutting through her thoughts. When she entered her office, Martin was already there, standing by the window. He turned slowly, his face tired, his eyes hollow. "I assume you've seen the reports," he said. Grace closed the door. "Tell me it isn't true." Martin's jaw tightened. "It started before you came, Grace. Before your mother even left the company. Richard Sterling underpaid her, falsified profits, and funneled money into accounts that didn't exist. I kept them open. Not for myself, but for her." She blinked, stunned. "For her?" I thought one day I could give it back. To you. He stepped closer. Every dollar in those accounts belongs to your mother. I just didn't expect you'd see the numbers before I could explain. Grace wanted to believe him, but something still didn't fit. You could have told me, she said quietly. You made me think you were clean. Martin's expression broke. Would you have trusted me if I had? She hesitated. Maybe not, but I deserved the truth. He nodded slowly, regret heavy in his eyes. You did, and now you have it. Before Grace could respond, her phone buzzed on the desk. An unknown number. She answered hesitantly. Miss Evans? Came a familiar, bitter voice. Alexander Sterling. Congratulations. You've managed to destroy what little integrity this company had left. Her blood ran cold. What do you want? To help, he said smoothly. You see, I've been watching the markets. Investors are nervous. If this audit goes public, Sterling Group collapses, and you go down with it. But I can fix it. I still have influence. Grace laughed bitterly. You're offering to save me? I'm offering to save your mother's legacy, he said. All you have to do is remove Hale, quietly. Make me your financial advisor for the transition. The headlines shift, the money stabilizes, and no one ever knows. Grace's stomach turned. You really think I'd trust you? Not trust, he said. Survival. You want to protect your mother's name, right? Then act like a Sterling. She hung up without another word. For a moment, she stood there, the weight of two worlds pressing down on her, the corruption of the man who stole her mother's dreams, and the betrayal of the man who'd sworn to protect them. Martin watched her carefully. What did he say? She looked at him, her voice steady. He wants me to bury you. Martin smiled faintly, sad but proud. Then I guess this is where you decide who you really are. Grace nodded, tears threatening but unshed. I already have. Later that afternoon, at the emergency press conference, Grace faced the cameras again, alone this time. Sterling Group has been built on power and deception for too long, she said firmly. Today, that ends. Every dollar misused will be returned. Every name erased will be restored. My mother's legacy will stand clean, or it won't stand at all. The reporters erupted with questions, but Grace didn't stay to answer. And as she walked off the stage, the flash of cameras behind her, she felt something shift. Not the weight of loss this time, but the strength that comes from choosing truth over comfort, no matter the cost. 3 weeks passed since Grace's press conference, and the city's skyline had never looked so different. The Sterling logo, once a symbol of wealth and power, now carried the weight of scandal and rebirth. Under Grace's leadership, the company had begun to rebuild, cutting away corruption, opening programs for fair pay, transparency, and opportunity. For the first time, people spoke the word Sterling with respect again. But not everyone had found peace. On a cold Tuesday afternoon, Grace's phone buzzed while she was meeting with the legal team. The screen flashed a name she hadn't seen in weeks, Alexander Sterling. Her team exchanged glances, uncertain. Grace stared at the phone for a moment, then answered. What do you want, Alexander? A long pause, then his voice, lower than she remembered. To talk. I don't think we have anything left to say. Maybe not. But there's something you should see. Meet me at Riverside Pier. 1 hour. Before she could respond, he hung up. Her assistant frowned. Do you think it's safe? Grace hesitated, then gathered her coat. If he wanted to hurt me, he's already had a dozen chances. I think he's just finished. The sun was setting when she reached the pier. The wind carried the smell of the Hudson, sharp and cold. She spotted him near the railing, dressed in a worn grey coat. Nothing like the polished man who once ruled boardrooms. His hair was disheveled, his face tired, his eyes empty. I didn't think you'd come, he said quietly. I didn't come for you, she replied. I came for closure. He nodded slowly. Then maybe we're here for the same thing. For a moment, They stood in silence, watching the river move. Then Alexander reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather box. "I found this in my father's study. It belonged to your mother." Grace frowned. "What is it?" He handed it to her. Inside was a gold bracelet, simple, elegant, engraved with the words, "Truth endures." Her breath caught. "I remember this. My grandmother said Mom never took it off." "She didn't," Alexander said softly. "My father kept it after she left. I think part of him knew what he did was wrong." Grace looked at him, searching his face. "Why are you giving this to me now?" "Because I don't want to carry it anymore," he said. "Or the guilt." She studied him, his posture, his trembling hands. This wasn't the arrogant man who had humiliated her. This was someone stripped bare by his own choices. "I've spent my whole life trying to prove I was my father's son," he said, voice breaking. "But all I became was his mistake. You were right, Grace. The company should have been hers. She was better than him. Better than both of us." Grace looked down at the bracelet. The metal was cold in her hand, but it seemed to pulse with warmth, the echo of a woman's strength that had outlived the people who tried to silence it. "You can still do something good," she said quietly. "Not for me, for yourself, for help fix what your family broke." He laughed bitterly. "I don't think they'd want my help." She met his eyes. "Then do it anyway. Redemption isn't about being invited. It's about showing up." He nodded, tears welling. "You sound like her." "I'm trying to," she whispered. They stood there for a long moment, the wind tugging at their coats, the river reflecting the city lights. When Alexander finally turned to leave, he looked lighter, as if the weight of decades had finally begun to lift. "Take care of her company," he said softly. "Do what I never could." Grace held the bracelet close to her chest. "I will." And as he disappeared into the crowd, she realized redemption wasn't a gift. It was a choice. And for once, Alexander Sterling had chosen the right one. Spring came quietly to New York. The snow melted from the rooftops. The city began to bloom again. And the name Evelyn Evans, once forgotten, now shimmered across the lobby of Sterling Group in gold letters. Below it, a plaque read, "Co-founder, visionary, the heart of Sterling." Grace stood before it, her reflection caught in the polished surface. The building no longer felt like a monument to greed. It felt like a home finally cleansed of its ghosts. The employees passing by greeted her, not with fear, but respect. They knew her story, her struggle, and the way she'd chosen forgiveness over revenge. She turned as Martin Hale approached, leaning slightly on his cane. He looked older, but lighter, as though survival itself had become his quiet victory. "You've rebuilt what everyone thought was lost," he said warmly. "Your mother would be proud." Grace smiled. Maybe. Or maybe she'd tell me I'm working too much and to go outside for some air. Martin chuckled. "That sounds about right." They walked toward the elevator together. On the walls hung framed photos, Evelyn and Richard in the early days of the company, blueprints, and now one of Grace at the new foundation launch. The Evelyn Evans Foundation had already begun providing scholarships and housing grants for single mothers and young women in tech. Grace pressed the elevator button. "It feels like it's finally hers again." "It is," Martin said, "but it's also yours." The doors opened, and they stepped inside. As they descended, Grace looked at him and asked softly, "Do you ever regret any of it? The lies, the years we lost?" He took a deep breath. "Every day. But regret doesn't fix the past. It only reminds us what not to repeat." When the doors opened again, the city sunlight poured through the lobby windows. The two walked outside into the gentle breeze. Grace's car was waiting, but she turned to Martin. "There's somewhere I need to go first." He nodded knowingly. "Your mother?" Grace smiled faintly. "And my grandmother. I think it's time." Later that afternoon, she arrived at a small cemetery on the outskirts of the city. The air was calm, the trees beginning to bloom. She knelt before two gravestones, One new, one older. Her mother's read, Evelyn Evans, the woman who built dignity from nothing. Grace placed a bouquet of white lilies at its base, her voice barely above a whisper. We did it, Mum. The truth's out. They finally said your name. She set down a second gift, the old pair of shoes she'd worn the night Alexander fired her. They were worn, cracked at the edges, but to her they were symbols of everything she had walked through to get here. She laughed softly. I thought those shoes were my shame. Turns out they were my armor. The wind stirred, and sunlight broke through the clouds, warm on her face. For a moment, she could almost hear her mother's laughter again, the same sound from the photograph Martin had given her. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Alexander Sterling. Just 2 words. Thank you. Grace smiled, slipping the phone back into her coat pocket. Forgiveness didn't erase the past, but it healed it enough to move forward. She stood, brushing the grass from her hands. Goodbye, Mum. Goodbye, Grandma. It's time to start living again. As she walked back toward the car, the skyline rose in the distance, bathed in gold from the setting sun. She felt no weight, no anger, just peace. The empire that had once broken her now stood as proof that Grace, her name, her strength, her legacy, was stronger than greed could ever be. And as the last light touched her mother's name, Grace Evans knew the story was no longer one of loss, but of redemption. A circle finally closed, and a life beautifully reclaimed. Somewhere out there, someone else might need to be reminded that pain can be the beginning, not the end. And remember, no matter where you stand today, you still have the power to rise with grace.